Some memories don't feel like stories we tell. They feel like bruises, deep, purple marks on the soul that you keep checking with your fingertips just to see if the pain is still there. And the worst part about those bruises, they never fade. They never heal. I used to spend my nights lying awake, trying to convince myself that the first time my mother let go of my hand, it was an accident. I told myself she got distracted by the rain. I told myself her grip simply slipped because her palms were sweaty. I told myself she didn't realize how small and fragile my fingers really were. But as I grew older, the lie became too heavy to carry. My mother didn't lose me. She didn't get distracted. She delivered me, like a package with no return address, like a debt that had finally come due. She looked at her 7-year-old daughter and decided that I was the currency she needed to buy her way out of a secret. Tonight, we are going back to the beginning, to the road that leads to the house that swallows sound. My name is Maya, and this is the story of how I was sold and how I finally came back to collect the truth. I want you to talk to me before we begin. Go to the comments and tell me where you are listening from. Are you in your kitchen in Lagos, your bedroom in London, or a dark car in Chicago? Type "The truth never dies" if you've ever survived a betrayal you weren't supposed to walk away from. Take a breath. It's a humid evening and the air is about to get very heavy. I don't remember the exact date the world ended, but I remember the weather with a precision that haunts me. It was one of those stifling evenings when the air feels like a wet cloth, heavy, warm, and suffocatingly still. It was the kind of air that makes adults irritable and makes children feel a strange, intuitive sense of dread. I was 7 years old. 7, an age where you are old enough to know your full name, old enough to know your home address, and old enough to recognize the specific, cloying, floral scent of your mother's perfume. My mother only wore that perfume when she wanted to feel like someone else, someone who wasn't tired, someone who wasn't hiding. On this night, she hadn't just sprayed it, she had drenched herself in it, as if she were trying to drown out the scent of her own fear. She told me we were going on a little trip. Her voice was too bright, a frantic, high-pitched lilt that sounded like a smile stretched thin over something rotten. I asked if I could bring my doll, the one with the missing button eye that I took everywhere. She said no. I asked if we'd be back in time for Saturday morning cartoons. She said yes. She said yes to everything that would make me stop asking questions, a rapid-fire string of lies that felt like a wall being built between us. Back then, my mother had 2 voices. Strangers got the soft voice, the polite, melodic one that carried laughter like a piece of jewelry she could put on and take off for the world to admire. I got the other voice, the one that sounded like she'd already decided I was a problem that needed a permanent solution. As she packed a small, battered suitcase, she didn't look at me once. She moved with a jagged, desperate energy, tossing in my socks and a single sweater as if she were discarding evidence. I stood in the doorway of her bedroom, clutching the doorframe, watching her erase me from the house bit by bit. I didn't understand that she wasn't packing for a vacation. She was packing away a life she no longer wanted to lead. We drove for a long time, long enough for the sky to turn from a bruised purple to a suffocating shade of charcoal, long enough for the radio to dissolve into a sea of static that she didn't bother to fix. I sat in the passenger seat, my legs dangling, watching her hands on the steering wheel. Her knuckles were ghostly white, her nails bitten down to the raw, pink quick. She kept checking the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but as if the past was chasing us down the highway. At one point, she reached over and gripped my knee. It wasn't a caress, it was a warning. "Don't talk." Her voice was a cold, sharp blade. I wasn't even talking. I was just existing. I was just being a 7-year-old child in the seat next to her. But to my mother in that car on that night, my silence wasn't enough. My very presence was a loud, echoing reminder of the secret she was trying to outrun. I stayed perfectly still, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying to become the invisible thing she clearly wanted me to be. I watched the streetlights flicker past, like a countdown to an ending I couldn't see coming. The car turned down a road that didn't look like the kind of place where families lived. The trees crowded overhead, their branches interlocked like skeletal fingers, blotting out what little light was left in the sky. The houses were far apart, sitting back from the road as if they were ashamed to be seen. And then we stopped. We stopped in front of a home that looked wrong. It wasn't broken down or dilapidated, it was just quiet. Too quiet. It was a house that seemed to swallow sound, a place where the shadows felt thicker than the air. My mother cut the engine. The silence dropped over us like a heavy lid on a coffin. She didn't look at me right away. She stared through the windshield at the dark porch, her chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. She looked like a woman who was bracing herself to walk into a fire. Then she turned to me, and for a split second I saw a flicker of the mother I thought I knew. I thought she might say she was sorry. I thought she might tell me it was all a mistake and turn the car around. But she didn't. She smoothed my hair with fingers that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. "You're going to be a good girl," she whispered. I nodded, because that's what children do. We nod because we think obedience is the only currency we have to buy back a mother's love. I didn't know that on this night, my obedience was exactly what she needed to walk away. The sound of the car door opening was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a sharp, mechanical crack that shattered the silence of the driveway, signaling that the little trip had reached its destination. My mother didn't get out right away. She sat there for a heartbeat, her hand on the handle, her eyes fixed on the dark house as if she were waiting for it to give her permission to move. Then she stepped out into the humid air. I followed her, my sneakers quenching on the gravel, a sound that felt like it was announcing my arrival to the shadows. I reached out and grabbed her hand, and for a fleeting second I felt a wave of relief. Her palm was damp and shaking, but her fingers closed around mine. I remember thinking, good, she's not letting go anymore. I didn't realize that her grip wasn't a hold of love, it was a hold of containment. She wasn't holding on to me, she was making sure I didn't run. We walked up the steps of the porch. The wood groaned beneath us, a low, warning sound that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. At the top, my mother didn't just knock, she used a rhythm. 1, 2, then 3 quick taps. It was a code, a secret language she had memorized, a signal that told whoever was on the other side that the payment had arrived. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird rhythm. I looked up at her, trying to catch her eye, but she was looking at the door with a terrifying blank intensity. She looked like a woman who had already left her body, leaving only a shell behind to finish the task. The door opened slowly. It didn't swing wide with a welcome, it retracted, revealing a sliver of a hallway that smelled of dust and something sour, like old milk spilled on a cold floor. A man stood there. He was tall, broad, and dressed in clothes that looked too heavy for the warm night. His face was a mask of absolute indifference. No smile, no greeting, no flicker of pity for the 7-year-old girl standing at his threshold. His eyes moved from my mother's face down to mine. He didn't look at me like a person, he looked at me like a piece of furniture he had been waiting for. My mother didn't say hello, she didn't introduce me. She simply looked at him, her eyes glossy with a fear so deep it looked like madness, and whispered a single word, "Please." In that moment, the betrayal became a physical weight. My mother's grip on my hand tightened, but instead of pulling me back toward the safety of the car, she guided me forward. She nudged me across the threshold into the dim yellow light of the hallway. I looked back at her, certain she would step in behind me. I expected her to follow, to tell me where my room was, to kiss me goodnight. But she stayed on the porch. She took one step back, then another, the shadows of the eaves swallowing her waist, then her chest. "Mom?" I said. The word felt like a tether I was trying to throw to a drowning person, but she flinched as if my voice were a physical blow to her face. She forced a smile, a jagged, painful expression that looked like glass breaking. She said, "I'll be back." It was a lie that tasted like copper in the air. As the man's heavy, calloused hand closed around my shoulder, a grip that felt like a permanent brand, I watched my mother turn her head. She didn't look at my face. She didn't look at my reaching hand. She looked at the driveway. She looked at her escape route. She whispered something I barely heard over the thrumming of the car's engine. Not, "I love you," not, "I'm sorry." She whispered, "Just be good." Then she turned, ran to the car, and drove away. I watched her red taillights flicker through the trees, growing smaller and smaller until they were just two tiny pricks of red in the vast black throat of the night. The man closed the door. The sound was soft, a tiny metallic click. It wasn't a slam. A slam would have felt like an ending, but a click felt like a beginning. It was the sound of the world shrinking down to the size of a hallway. He didn't ask me if I was hungry. He didn't ask my name. He just led me down a corridor where the walls were stripped of pictures, leaving only the pale, rectangular ghosts of where family photos used to be. He led me to a small room with a narrow bed and a window with blinds shut so tight no moonlight could get in. He pointed at the bed and said one word, "Sit." I sat. I sat there in my little trip clothes, my heart still in the driveway, while the man watched me from the doorway. He watched me with the clinical, detached gaze of a buyer making sure the merchandise wouldn't break. Then he left, and I heard the lock turn from the outside. That was the moment the truth finally rose in my throat like bile. My mother wasn't coming back for cartoons. She wasn't coming back for me. She had traded my childhood for her secret, and the only thing left of her in that room was the fading floral scent of her perfume on my hair, a scent that would haunt my nightmares for the next 21 years. That first night in the room was not a night of sleep. It was a night of learning. I lay on that narrow bed, the mattress stiff and smelling of mothballs and long-forgotten dust, staring at the ceiling until the darkness began to play tricks on my eyes. Every house has a language, a vocabulary of creaks, hums, and settling floorboards. But this house spoke a language of absolute, crushing void. In a normal home, you hear the muffled sound of the television, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, or the low murmur of adults talking about the weather. In this house, sound was a sin. I lay there waiting for the front door to open again. I waited for the sound of my mother's car, for the frantic click of her heels on the porch, for her to burst in and say she'd made a terrible mistake. But the only thing that came was the cold, blue light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the blinds. The next morning, the door didn't just open, it was unlocked. That sound, the sharp metallic clack of a key, became the new rhythm of my life. A woman entered. She wasn't the man, but she carried the same atmosphere of hollowed-out indifference. She didn't look at me. She didn't ask if I had slept. She didn't offer a hand to help me up. She simply placed a plastic plate of cold toast and a glass of water on the small wooden nightstand and left. She moved like a machine, her face a mask of ironed-out emotions. I realized then that I wasn't being welcomed into a family, I was being processed into a system. I was the girl. I was that child. I was a piece of inventory that required a specific amount of maintenance and not a single drop more. The rules of the house were never written down, but they were etched into the air within 48 hours. Rule number 1, be quiet. Rule number 2, be obedient. Rule number 3, be invisible. I learned that my tears were a currency that held no value here. The first few days, I cried until my eyes were swollen shut, until my throat felt like it had been scraped with glass. I cried for my mother. I cried for my doll. I cried for the Saturday cartoons that were playing in a world I no longer belonged to. But no one came. No one hushed me. No one told me it would be okay. They simply waited for me to stop, as if my grief were an annoying weather pattern that would eventually pass. As the weeks blurred into months, and the months into a long, gray stretch of years, my identity began to erode. I learned to move through the hallways like a shadow, pressing my back against the wall to let the man pass. I learned to anticipate the woman's moods by the way she set down a plate. I learned that if I stayed perfectly still, I could overhear the things they thought I was too young to understand. This house was a clearinghouse of secrets, and I was the biggest secret of all. The man would have visitors, men in expensive suits who arrived in the middle of the night, their cars parked far down the driveway. They would go into the study, and I would press my ear to the floorboards in my room, listening to the vibration of their voices. It was through those floorboards that I began to collect the pieces of my mother's betrayal. I heard her name mentioned once, followed by a laugh that made my blood turn to ice. "She was so desperate to keep it quiet," the man said. "She would have given us anything. The kid was just the easiest thing to hand over." I didn't know then what it was. I didn't know the nature of the secret that was worth the life of a 7-year-old girl. All I knew was that my mother had looked at a man like him, a man who smelled of sour smoke and calculated cruelty, and decided that he was a safer bet than her own flesh and blood. She hadn't been forced, she had negotiated. In that house, time didn't move like a river, it moved like a swamp. You didn't grow up, you just became more durable. I stopped looking at the window. I stopped waiting for the red taillights to reappear in the driveway. I buried the girl who liked Saturday cartoons in a shallow grave in my mind, and in her place, I built a survivor. I became watchful. I became patient. I became the kind of person who could wait 10 years for a single door to be left unlatched. I realized that my mother hadn't just sold me to people who wanted control, she had sold me to a life where silence was the only thing keeping me alive. And as I grew, the silence didn't just protect me, it became a weapon I was learning how to sharpen. By the time I was 16, I had become a master of the invisible. I had spent 9 years memorizing the geography of a prison I hadn't earned. I knew which floorboards in the upstairs hallway groaned under the slightest pressure and which ones remained silent. I knew the exact window of time, between 2:15 and 2:45 in the morning, when the man's heavy, rhythmic snoring would drown out the sound of a heartbeat. I wasn't the child who had arrived in a floral-scented haze anymore. I was a shadow with a ledger. I had spent my adolescence not studying for exams or dreaming of prom, but counting exits. I counted the seconds it took for the woman to hang the house keys on the brass hook in the kitchen. I counted the paces from my bedroom door to the back porch. I was a girl built out of numbers and cold, hard patience. The escape wasn't a Hollywood moment. There were no sirens, no dramatic leap from a balcony, no police cars waiting at the end of the drive. It was far more terrifying because it was so quiet. It happened on a Tuesday in November, a night when the air was sharp and smelled of dead leaves and wood smoke. The woman had been distracted, a phone call that had left her hands shaking and her eyes vacant. She had left the kitchen keys sitting just 2 inches too far to the left of the hook. A mistake, a single tiny crack in the armor of the house. I watched from the shadows of the dining room as she retreated to her room, the click of her door echoing like a starting pistol. I moved through the house with a grace born of desperation. My heart was beating so violently I was certain the walls would begin to shake with the rhythm of it. Every breath felt like I was swallowing glass. I reached the kitchen counter. My fingers, trembling and cold, brushed against the metal of the keys. They felt heavy, like the anchor of a ship I was finally cutting loose. I didn't take them right away. I stood there, listening to the house breathe. I listened for the man's stir, for the woman's cough. Nothing. Just the wind rattling the frames of the windows that had kept me a prisoner for half my life. I slid the keys into my pocket, the tiny jingle sounding like a scream in the stillness. I didn't take a suitcase. I didn't take the few clothes I owned. I took only the notebook I had hidden beneath my mattress, a collection of names, dates, and overheard fragments of the secret my mother had died to protect. I slipped out the back door. The air hit me like a physical blow, fresh, wild, and terrifyingly vast. I had forgotten what the world felt like without a roof over it. I didn't walk, I ran. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire, until my bare feet were cut by the stones in the driveway, until the house of silent rules was nothing but a dark shape in the rear view of my memory. I ran until I reached the main road, the asphalt cold and indifferent beneath me. Freedom is not the relief the stories tell you it is. For someone who has been owned, freedom feels like falling. There is no floor, there is no ceiling, there is only the terrifying realization that no one is coming to catch you. I spent that first night huddled under a bridge, clutching my notebook to my chest as if it were a shield. I watched the headlights of passing cars, each one a potential predator, each one a ghost of the red taillights that had abandoned me at 7 years old. I realized then that escaping the house was the easy part. The hard part would be escaping the girl who had been taught that she was nothing more than a payment. I survived the next few years in a blur of shelters, cheap diners, and the kind of work that leaves your hands raw and your mind numb. I learned to sleep with one eye open. I learned to flinch when someone spoke my name, or rather the name they gave me, because Maya still felt like a secret I wasn't allowed to keep. I hated Mother's Day. I hated the sight of children holding hands with women in floral perfume. Every time I saw a normal life, it felt like a joke the world was playing on me. I tried to bury her, the woman who had delivered me. I tried to convince myself she was dead. But you can't bury someone who is still living in the architecture of your nightmares. I was free, but the space around me was filled with the echoes of that soft, metallic click of a locking door. I was 28 years old, and I was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't know that the shoe wouldn't just drop, it would lead me right back to her porch. For 12 years, I existed in the margins. I was a woman who lived without a history, a person whose life began at 16 on a dark road with bleeding feet. I worked at a small, independent printing shop on the outskirts of the city, a place where the air was always thick with the scent of ozone, chemical ink, and the steady mechanical hum of machines that didn't ask questions. It was the perfect job for a ghost. I liked the anonymity of the counter, the way I could hide behind the tasks of collating and binding. I had no friends close enough to ask about my childhood, no photographs on my mantle, and no family to call on holidays. I had built a life out of survival habits, a life that was quiet, sterile, and safe, or so I told myself. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that feels unremarkable until the moment it shatters. The shop was empty except for an older man who walked in just as the sun was beginning to dip. He wore a suit that looked expensive even in its wrinkled state, and he carried a leather briefcase that spoke of boardrooms and secrets. He didn't look at me when he approached the counter, he looked through me. He handed me a thick manila folder and asked for 3 copies of everything inside. "High resolution," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "and keep the originals in the order you found them." I nodded, my fingers moving automatically as I opened the folder to begin the task. My stomach didn't just drop, it turned to ice. Inside the folder were documents that felt like they had been pulled directly from the nightmares I had spent a decade trying to bury. There, printed in bold, uncompromising black ink, was a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud since the night I escaped the House of Silent Rules. A powerful man's name, a name that had been whispered through vents and hissed over late-night phone calls. My hands began to shake so violently that I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from collapsing. I turned the page, my vision blurring, and that's when I saw it. It was a photograph, a glossy print that had survived the years with a cruel, mocking clarity. It showed a younger version of the man from the house, smiling, handsome in a predatory way, looking like the king of a world I had only seen from the shadows. And standing right beside him, her arm looped through his as if she belonged there, was my mother. Her hair was darker then, her eyes were braider, and she was wearing a dress that looked like it cost more than our old apartment. She wasn't being forced, she wasn't being coerced. She was smiling at the camera with a look of absolute, terrifying pride. She looked like a woman who had finally achieved the status she was willing to trade her daughter for. "Is there a problem?" the man in the suit asked, his voice cutting through the fog of my shock. I looked up, and for a second I thought he saw me, truly saw me. I forced my voice to stay steady, even as my body felt like it was dissolving. "No," I lied, the word tasting like copper in my mouth. I turned away from him, my back to the counter, and I felt the secret finally take a physical shape. My mother wasn't just a shadow in my mind, she was a person in a photograph who had made a conscious, calculated choice. She hadn't sold me to protect a secret, she had sold me because I was proof of a life she wanted to erase. I was the evidence of a past that didn't fit into the frame of her new, perfect photograph. That night, I didn't go home to my quiet apartment. I sat in my car for hours, the photograph burned into my retinas. I realized that I didn't want revenge in the way the movies describe it. I didn't want to burn things down. I wanted the one thing I had been denied for 21 years, the truth. I wanted to look into the eyes of the woman who delivered me like a package and hear her say the words out loud. I wanted to break the silence she had bought with my childhood. I went back to my apartment and opened the notebook I had kept since I was 16. I started searching. With the names from the folder and the technology of a world that no longer allowed for total disappearance, it didn't take long. I found her. She was living in a neat house with flower pots on the porch, a life that looked peaceful and earned. I stared at the address on my screen and felt the 7-year-old girl inside me stand up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being moved. I was the one moving. I was going to knock on my mother's door. The drive to her house felt like a fever dream, a slow-motion transit between the woman I had become and the child I had been forced to leave behind. Every mile I traveled toward that address felt like a year peeling away. My chest was so tight I could barely draw air, the oxygen feeling thin and sharp, like I was climbing a mountain I wasn't prepared for. I had played this moment out in my head 1,000 times over 21 years. In some versions, she fell to her knees and begged for a forgiveness I didn't possess. In others, she didn't even remember my name. But as I pulled up to the curb, the reality was far more insulting. It was normal. The house was a picture-perfect slice of the life I was never allowed to have. It had a porch with neatly painted railings and flower pots filled with vibrant, well-tended geraniums. There were curtains in the window, fresh, white, and clean, the kind of curtains that suggested a woman who slept soundly at night. The normalness of it made me furious. It was a physical manifestation of her ability to move on, to build a sanctuary on top of the grave of my childhood. I sat in the car, my hands gripped so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles ached. I counted my breaths. 1, 2, 3. I wasn't the 7-year-old girl being pushed out of the car anymore. I was the one walking up the path. The porch boards creaked beneath my feet, the sound echoing through the quiet street. It was a familiar sound, a ghost of the groan the wood had made the night she delivered me to the man. I reached the door, my hand lifted, heavy and trembling, and I knocked. I didn't just knock, I used the rhythm. 1, 2, 3. The same code she had used to signal the transaction all those years ago. I wanted her to hear it. I wanted her to feel the past calling to her before she even saw my face. The door opened, and there she was. She was older, her hair streaked with a silver that looked like a penance she hadn't earned. Her face was lined, but her eyes, those sharp, observant eyes, were exactly the same. For a second, her face held the polite, distant confusion she reserved for strangers. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was careful, measured. I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch between us, a cold, widening chasm. I watched the moment the recognition hit her. I watched her eyes narrow, then widen with a terror so pure it made her knees buckle. "No," she whispered, the word a frantic, broken thing. She tried to close the door, but I stepped forward, my boot catching the frame. "Do you recognize me?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like the house of silent rules, cold, hard, and final. She clutched the edge of the door, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely hold on. "Maya," she breathed. It wasn't a greeting, it was a confession. She looked past me to the street, her gaze darting to her neighbors' windows, checking to see if anyone was watching her secrets come home. Even now, facing the daughter she had sold, her first instinct was to hide the evidence. "I'm not here to beg," I said, leaning closer so only she could hear. "I'm here for the one thing you never gave me. I want to know why." She looked at me as if I were a ghost, her face crumbling into a mask of pathetic, late-term guilt. "I did what I had to do," she whispered, using the universal language of cowards. She tried to tell me she was trapped, that she was scared, that she was forced. But as she spoke, her eyes slid away from mine. She wasn't protecting me from a man, she was protecting her status from the proof of her past. "You were evidence," I told her, my voice like ice. "I wasn't your child, I was the thing that would ruin your new life." She reached back into the house and grabbed a worn manila folder from the hallway table. She held it out like a shield. "If you're going to do this, do it right. It's all in here. Names, dates, everything." Even her remorse was practical. She had kept the secret as protection, a final bribe to keep the world from finding out who she really was. I took the folder, the weight of it a heavy, physical ending to 21 years of silence. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I didn't see a mother. I saw a woman who had sold the part of her child that she believed she was worth keeping. I walked off that porch without another word. I didn't need her apology. I had the truth. And as I walked into the night, I realized the soft click of the door closing behind me was finally the sound of a story that I, and only I, was authorized to tell. I didn't drive home. I couldn't. The air inside my car felt like it was pressurized, heavy with the phantom scent of my mother's floral perfume and the cold, metallic taste of the truth I was holding in my lap. I drove until the suburban houses blurred into the neon-lit grit of the city, pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. I sat in a back booth, the vinyl sticking to my skin, and placed the folder on the table. It looked innocent enough, just a stack of weathered paper, but I knew it was the detonator to a life my mother had spent 21 years building. As I opened the folder, I expected to find a confession, I expected to find a letter addressed to me explaining why a 7-year-old girl was a fair trade for a clean slate. But my mother had never been that sentimental. The folder didn't contain an apology, it contained an audit. It was a meticulous, cold-blooded record of a decade of corruption. My mother hadn't just been protected by the powerful man, she had been his primary bookkeeper. She had been the one moving the money, the one erasing the footprints, the one who turned a city's resources into a private empire. She hadn't sold me to protect a secret, she had sold me because I was the only witness to the nights the powerful man visited our home to sign those ledgers. I was the only one who could identify the face behind the funds. I spent the next 4 hours reading through the names. Names of senators, names of judges, names of men who stood on podiums and talked about family values while they paid for my silence with my own childhood. My mother had kept these records as her own insurance policy. She knew that if the powerful man ever decided she was a liability, these papers would be her only shield. She had been living in a Cold War for 21 years, using my life as the first payment and these documents as the final one. I felt a new kind of coldness settle into my bones. For years, I had wondered if she cried when she drove away. I wondered if she regretted the transaction. But looking at the dates on these deposits, dates that corresponded with the weeks I spent crying in that locked room, I realized she wasn't mourning, she was calculating. While I was learning to be invisible, she was learning to be indispensable. She had used the money from my sale to buy that house with the flower pots. She had used the silence I provided to build a reputation as a pillar of the community. Every brick of her new life was cemented with the years I had lost. I looked at my reflection in the dark window of the diner. I wasn't the 7-year-old girl anymore, and I wasn't the 16-year-old running through the woods. I was something else. I was the consequence. My mother had handed me this folder thinking I would take the truth and go back into the shadows. She thought that by giving me the why, she was buying my silence once again. But she had raised a survivor, and survivors don't keep secrets for the people who broke them. I realized that I didn't want her to be sorry. I wanted her to be exposed. I didn't want a mother. I wanted a reckoning. I picked up my phone and made the first call. I didn't call the police. I called a man whose name was on page 12 of the folder, a man who had been destroyed by the powerful man and had been waiting 20 years for a way to fight back. There's a specific kind of silence that precedes a storm, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, vibrating silence of a trap being set. For 3 days, I didn't return to my apartment. I didn't go back to the print shop. I lived out of my car and a series of anonymous motels, my laptop glowing in the dark like a campfire. My mother had handed me that folder as an exit strategy, a way to buy my departure. She thought I would take the truth and vanish back into the life of a ghost. She didn't realize that when you spend 10 years learning how to listen through floorboards, you don't just hear secrets, you learn the architecture of how to tear them down. I spent those 72 hours digitizing every scrap of evidence, every bank statement that bore the powerful man's signature, every ledger entry in my mother's elegant, cold handwriting. I didn't just see numbers, I saw the price of my childhood. $50,000 for a consultation that happened the week I was locked in that room. $100,000 for services rendered on the night I cried until I was sick. My mother hadn't just been his bookkeeper, she had been his shadow. And now I was becoming hers. I began to send the files. Not to the police, not yet. I sent them to the one place where a secret like this goes to die or to explode: the local investigative news bureau and the State Ethics Commission. I sent them under a pseudonym that I had carried in the dark for years: the girl who remembers. By Thursday, the silent invasion had begun. I didn't need to be in the room to feel the shift. I could see it in the way the local news began to run special reports on the powerful man's mysterious campaign contributions. I could see it in the way the stock of his construction firm began to stutter and dip. My mother's world was a house of cards, and I was the wind that was finally blowing through the cracks. I sat in a coffee shop 3 blocks from her neat little house, watching the street on my phone's GPS. I watched the black SUVs begin to circle the neighborhood. Not predators this time, but investigators. The people who had protected the powerful man for decades were starting to look for a way out, and they were looking at the woman with the flower pots as the easiest person to throw overboard. Then my phone lit up. It was a number I hadn't seen in 21 years. My mother. I didn't answer. I let it vibrate until the screen went dark. Then I watched it happen again and again. She was realizing that the folder hadn't bought my silence. It had fueled my fire. She was realizing that the daughter she had sold wasn't a victim anymore. She was a witness. I imagined her standing in her clean kitchen, looking at those fresh white curtains, feeling the air in the room grow thin. I imagined her realizing that the powerful man couldn't protect her anymore because he was too busy trying to protect himself. The silence she had cultivated for 21 years was finally being replaced by the sound of sirens, and they were getting closer every minute. I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. It wasn't the joy I had expected. It was the feeling of a debt finally being reconciled. My mother had spent 2 decades living on the interest of my misery, and now the principal was due. I finished my coffee, closed my laptop, and walked out into the cool evening air. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding in the margins. I was standing in the center of the reckoning. I drove toward her street one last time, not to speak to her, but to be there when the lights finally went out on the lie. I wanted to see the exact moment the perfect Mrs. Hale realized that a secret is only as strong as the person who is keeping it, and I had decided I was no longer interested in the job. The collapse of an empire doesn't happen with a roar. It happens with the sound of shredding paper and the frantic, hushed voices of men who realize they are no longer untouchable. On Friday morning, the city woke up to a headline that didn't just whisper, it screamed. The powerful man, the one whose name had been a sacred shield for my mother, was splashed across every screen in the state. The folder I had delivered hadn't just been a collection of secrets. It was a roadmap to a decade of systemic theft. I sat in my car 3 blocks away from her house, watching the world I had been sold to protect dissolve into a sea of flashing lights and yellow tape. The SUVs didn't just cruise the neighborhood anymore. They stopped. I watched through my binoculars as 4 agents in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back walked up the same porch steps I had climbed just nights before. They didn't knock with a rhythm. They didn't wait for an invitation. They moved with the clinical, unstoppable force of the law. I saw the front door, the one with the fresh paint and the polished brass, swing open. My mother stood there, her face a mask of pale, frozen shock. She looked small. For the first time in 21 years, she wasn't the one in control of the room. She was the one being surrounded. I watched as they began to carry things out. Cardboard boxes filled with the meticulous ledgers she had kept, the laptop she used to manage the powerful man's interests. Even the decorative flower pots were nudged aside as they searched for the hidden safes she thought no one would ever find. It was a physical dismantling of her dignity. Every item they touched was a piece of the life she had bought with my silence. I saw her neighbors, the people who had invited her to brunch and admired her earned peace, standing on their lawns, their faces filled with a voyeuristic horror. They weren't looking at a friend anymore, they were looking at a criminal. The perfect Mrs. Hale was being erased in real time. Then it happened. They led her out. Her hands were cuffed behind her back, her shoulders slumped in a way that made her look older than her years. She wasn't wearing the floral perfume or the expensive dress from the photograph. She was wearing a plain sweater and a look of absolute hollowed-out defeat. As they guided her toward the back seat of the lead SUV, she stopped. She looked down the street, her gaze searching the line of parked cars as if she knew I was there. She was looking for the escape route one last time, but there were no exits left. The girl who had been the payment was now the person who had closed the accounts. I rolled down my window as the convoy began to move. I didn't hide. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to see the person she thought she had successfully discarded. As her car passed mine, I held up the notebook, the one I had carried since I was 16, the one filled with the scraps of the truth I had gathered from the floorboards. I didn't need to say a word. The look in her eyes as she recognized that notebook was enough. It was the moment she realized that karma isn't a mystical force, it's just the long-term memory of the people you've hurt. I watched her taillights fade as they turned the corner, but this time they weren't the lights of a woman driving away into a new life. They were the lights of a woman being driven into the consequences of her old one. The empire was gone, and I was the only one left standing in the ruins. The silence that follows a storm is different from the silence that precedes it. The air on my mother's street was finally clear, the heavy, pressurized weight of 21 years of secrets having finally burst. I sat in my car long after the SUVs had disappeared, long after the neighbors had retreated back into their own perfect, fragile lives. I watched the house, the one with the fresh white curtains and the blue shutters. It looked like a hollow shell now, a stage set after the play has ended and the actors have been dragged off to face their critics. It wasn't a home, it was a crime scene, and I was the only witness who had survived to tell the ending. I got out of the car. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I walked up the path to the porch one last time. The yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, a bright, garish reminder that the radiant cage was officially decommissioned. I reached the top step and looked down at the wood. It didn't groan this time. It didn't feel like a trap. It felt like cedar and paint. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old set of brass keys, the ones I had stolen when I was 16. I didn't need them to get inside. The FBI had already seen to that. I just wanted to feel the weight of them. I wanted to remember the girl who thought these were the only way out. I looked through the front window. The hallway was a mess of overturned drawers and scattered papers, the physical manifestation of a life built on a lie being dismantled by the truth. I didn't feel the surge of hatred I expected. I didn't feel the hot, searing flame of revenge. What I felt was a profound, quiet lightness. It was the feeling of a debt being erased from the ledger. My mother had spent 2 decades trying to protect her peace, but she had never realized that peace bought with a child's soul is just a stay of execution. Eventually, the bill comes due, and I was the one who had finally collected. I walked back to my car and drove toward the park near the edge of town, the one where mothers took their children to play in the sun. I sat on a bench, the morning light warming my face, and I pulled out my notebook. I turned to the last page, the one I had left blank for years, waiting for the ending I wasn't sure I would ever get to write. I took a pen and wrote 3 words: I am kept. I didn't mean that I was owned by a man or a house or a secret. I meant that I had kept myself. I had kept the girl who liked Saturday cartoons alive through the darkness. I had kept the truth until it was strong enough to speak. I had kept my own soul when everyone else was trying to sell it. People will tell you that the truth sets you free, but they don't tell you that freedom is heavy. It's the weight of a life you have to build for yourself, without a script and without a cage. I looked at the children playing on the grass, their laughter a bright silver sound that didn't have to be hushed. I realized then that my story wasn't just about a mother who sold her daughter. It was about a daughter who bought herself back. I wasn't the girl or that child anymore. I was Maya. I was 28 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for the exit. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I started the car and drove away, not toward a motel or a shelter, but toward the life I had chosen. The folder was in the shredder, the powerful man was in a cell, and my mother was finally facing the silence she had earned. I rolled down the windows and let the wind rush in, wild, fresh, and smelling of nothing but the future. The debt was paid, the secrets were aired, and as the city skyline rose up to meet me, I realized that the best part of the truth is not just that it sets you free, it's that it finally lets you go home to yourself. My mother sold me to protect a secret, but tonight the truth is the only thing left standing. Some people spend their lives building walls to keep the past out. They don't realize that the past is already inside, waiting for the moment you think you're safe to finally speak. Courage isn't just surviving the betrayal, it's outlasting the liars. If you've ever had to reclaim your own name from the people who tried to erase it, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps these stories of resilience alive. Share this with one person who needs to know that their story isn't over yet. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from, and what is the truth you're finally ready to tell? This is Echoes of Trust and Betrayal, where the silence is broken, the debts are paid, and the truth finally sets us free.